Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Pete Reed. I'm Associate Director for Program Services in the Professional Development Department at NASSP. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Our topic today is Standards for School Leaders, ISLLC 2015. The Interstate School Leaders Licensure Consortium Standards for School Leaders has recently undergone its second revision. We're pleased to have with us today Dr. Joseph Murphy, who served as the founding chair of the original ISLLC standards and also served as chairperson leading the latest revision. Dr. Murphy is the Frank W. Mayborn Chair of Education and Associate Dean at Peabody College of Education, Vanderbilt University. Our thanks to the Wallace Foundation for sponsoring the revision of the ISLLC standards and today's webinar. At the end of the webinar, I'll provide you with additional information about how you can access materials from the Wallace Foundation. Should you have any technical problems during the broadcast today, please call Rich at 703-860-0759. I'll give you a second to jot that number down in case you need it after the slide goes away. As you participate in the webinar today, we invite you to expand the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag NASSP webinar. You can also follow NASSP on Twitter. Our handle is @NASSP. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/principals. During the webinar today, Dr. Murphy invites your questions. Please submit them using the question box on your GoToWebinar panel. He will respond to as many questions as time permits. If we run out of time to answer all of the questions, we'll respond by email following the broadcast. We will be recording the webinar. It will be available on our website in the near future at www.nassp.org/webinar-videos. And now, I would like to bring in our presenter to start the webinar, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Pete. I appreciate that. You hearing me, Pete?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Good. Just for the audience, we had played around with this quite a bit to make it work, so I'm pleased to actually have connections. I want to thank NASSP for the invitation to be able to chat with people this afternoon. And I want to thank the committee that did the work that actually revised the standards. In particular, I'd like to single out Beverly Hutton, who represented NASSP on the committee. She was one of the 7 of us and was a great comrade and stood by the practitioner audience quite a bit as we worked through some of these dilemmas. And also I'd like to thank Pete and his colleagues there for their patience with me on this technology here. So I just want to do a little bit of intro first and then walk you through the system, how it all came together and what worked. The standards, you may or may not remember, were originally created in 1995 and were released in 1996. ISLLC standards, and there were 6 standards, and they were updated in 2008. Recently, the Council of Chief State School Officers asked the Wallace Foundation if it would be they thought it would be a good time to actually have another revision of the standards, and the Wallace Foundation agreed and funded the ISLLC revision work. The other group that's deeply involved is called the National Policy Board for Educational Administration, which is made up of the executives of all the groups in the area of school administration in the country. So that would include Joanne Barr-Ledley from NASSP, Executive Director from NASP, Gail Conley, and right on down the line. There's about 12 of those folks that are involved as well at the policy level. So that's a bit of background. I want to just start into the slide now, and we'll wait for, see if we get any questions, which we'll be happy to take up at the end of the time. Pete? Thank you, sir. All right, so we have a name, Standards for School Leaders, the Interstate School Leaders Licensure Consortium 2015. And you will see there, I want to talk a little bit about the some background on the information, and the questions we usually get are things like where did they come from, what's the scope, and depth, balance, and use kind of information. So we will start with sources of information, and you will see there the first place we looked was the empirical evidence on leadership in effective schools, which we also call all the work on school improvement, pretty much anything that's turned up the role of a school leader in making a difference in the quality of the school and the learning of children in those schools. So that's our big source of data. The second source of data, which we crafted, which we used quite extensively, was what we call the wisdom of practice, or craft knowledge, or kind of the wisdom that principals have in their heads from being principals. So when we originally developed the standards in about a year ago, we put the first draft out. We had people comment on, come back. Then we got a little bit crisper. We sent it out and got feedback from principals and superintendents in particular about what they thought should be in the standards, what they wanted, what was important to them, what they knew from their own practice. And we had a group spend about 6 or 8 months on that. They did a lot of survey work through NASSP and then ESP in particular. They did a number of focus groups around the country with high school principals, middle school principals, elementary principals, and superintendents. And all that information we took and then had another set of revisions around the draft standards so we could make sure that that knowledge base was a central part of the fabric here. The other thing is important to remember is that standards for a profession are more than empirical knowledge. Many of the decisions you guys make every day are ethical, moral, value-based decisions, like privileging kids placed at risk in your school. That's not an empirical question, that's a value issue. And those things are critical for a profession, so we have included them as well in the, as we hammered together what would go in the standards. And then finally, we looked at the literature somewhat on parents, but mostly on students. What students, when we speak to students and hear students and see schools through their eyes, they tell us a good deal about what effective schools look like, and they also tell us what effective principals look like from their perspective. So we took that wisdom as well and hammered that in. So that's kind of the ground of the seed bed, if you will, from which we grew the revised standards. Now, the other thing on this introduction I want to just remind us, the first decision that the ISLLC committee made back in 1994, 1995 when they started, was that the standards would apply to all leaders in education. This wasn't just for new principals or for assistant principals or superintendents, that all these standards are generic in the sense that they touch everyone who's in a formal leadership position in schools. How that plays out, what it means to engage with a clientele, for example, is quite different in a high school than it is in a district office, but the fact of engaging meaningfully with the clientele is not optional under the standards. So they do apply to all leaders. That, I think, is very helpful for us. Another thing that we hear a lot is people say, well, we need more specificity, Murph. We have to have more specificity about these standards. And I don't, the way we've always looked at them is that they are not actionable in the form that they're in. That is, they direct people to exactly where they need to go, I think. But they only take on deeper meaning when they're applied to something. So if you have to take the standard, say, for example, on pastoral care for kids, is standard number 4. And the question is, all right, well, how does that come to life in a preparation program? How do we help people who are learning the job to do that? Or how do you help the development world? I gave a keynote yesterday on this at Learning Forward Conference, and I was talking to the development people who have to bring material and resources to life to bring pastoral care idea to principals so that they can put it into place in their schools. So the issue is, it clearly says we're going to the West Coast, but it doesn't say how we're going to travel or what all the detail is in between. That has to happen through preparation, when these get attached to preparation programs or licensure or principal evaluation or principal professional development. So they are at a higher level than people need the more detailed level. They just don't come out in 4 pages of standards. The next point is Pete?
Okay, hang on.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. We'd probably be a tag team here, my friend. All right. All right. So the other important thing is, people will say sometimes, well, you know, you repeat yourself in the standards, and that's by design. I mean, the standards are designed to stand alone, each one, in some real way, but in some way they only come to life when the threads across the standards actually begin to come into place. So, for example, one of the standards is developing culturally appropriate education for children and communities, and that's a separate standard. We talked a lot about that and worked on it. But that idea also appears when we talk about instruction, and when we talk about engagement with families, and we talk about curriculum. So that notion of culturally appropriateness appears in standards and also rests by itself. And you'll see that when you get the full picture, you'll see that overlapping, what we call that threading together of the standards, is really by design. That's not an accident. All right, this is a point that I made earlier when I introduced, I want to be clear to, and that is the standards can sit on a shelf like a curriculum, or they can be put to use. And in order to be put to use, they have to be applied to core leverage points, like how you evaluate high school principals, or how you prepare people to be high school principals, or how you design the job of a vice principal and associate principal at a high school level. It's those points when the detail needs to be brought to bear, because what it means, again, what one of these issues might mean would be different if you're talking to a superintendent. It would be different if you're talking to a high school principal. It would be a little different to come to life if it's an assistant principal. It could be different to come to life in a rural school versus an urban school. So that those issues come into play when the standards actually are brought to bear on particular issues. All right, now this is the, when you get to the bottom line and people say, well, what is the foundation of these standards at the end of the day? And all great schools, every great school that ever was, that is today and will be in the future, rest on 2 pillars, and only 2 pillars. And those 2 pillars are non-negotiable. They don't change. They are the center of gravity for greatness in schools. One of those is this powerful sense of academic press. Schools that are defined by powerful academic norms like challenge, evidence-based decision-making, places where high expectations for children are abundant, where kids are asked to do, have a significant opportunity to learn and chances to develop really rigorous academic knowledge, skills, and dispositions. That's foundational. But the other half of that foundation is what we call community for kids or productive culture. And here's the key message. Both of these strands are essential to create great schools. We know that. If you only use academic press, you're going to have trouble. And if you only use productive culture for kids, you're going to have trouble. And particularly if you're working with kids who are at risk, underserved kids, second language kids, kids who in poverty and so forth, without the culture part of that DNA strand, you really, really are trying to carry a pretty heavy package straight uphill, and it's not likely to be successful. So everything about the standards rest on these two foundational ideas, and they're designed to bring these two ideas to life. So that's the grounding. Now, let me actually introduce the standards, if I can, as well. So if you look under academic press, and again, these things overlap. You can see the two arrows above wrap around each other, but just to pull them out for analysis. One of the standards deals with what we call instructional capital and the other things that you do and you know, and that is if you have, if you spend the kind of time you need to get great teachers into the building to start with, you're going to be a whole lot more likely to go on vacation than if you have to get a cot to sleep in your office because you're worried about that all the time. So this notion of bringing what we call instructional capacity to life, structural capital, if you will, is really central to the job. People talk about it today. You know, the jargon is talent management and human capital and so forth and so on. But that's basically what this is: hiring, supervising, evaluating, helping develop people so they become stronger and stronger. That's a central dimension. That's one of the 11 dimensions, or one of the standards, if you will. The second one is obviously instructional quality instruction. 40% of what students learn in schools is directly attributable to the quality of the teaching that goes on in the classrooms. So you have things working well and you don't have great instruction, you're kind of walking with an arm and a leg behind your back. So one of the second critical job really of principals is to figure out ways to ratchet up quality of instruction in classrooms, obviously. The third standard really revolves around robust curriculum and assessment, and we know that a lot of the curriculum is not particularly robust, and we know that a lot of the curriculum that kids place at risk in society, underserved kids, is particularly non-robust curriculum. And the issue of assessment is critical here as well. We know a lot of assessment. Here's what some of the things we do know. We do know that we have built up fairly important assessment of academic achievement of kids in schools. Some of it's not the best, but we have it. But we know that there's very, very little formal assessment on the other half of that DNA strand I showed you, which is community for kids. So if I went to your school and said, well, how can you show me that kids are proficient in English history, you would have an answer to that. If I said, please show me the evidence that this student who I have my hand on is known and cared for in the school, we don't tend to assess that very well. We don't tend to assess it at all. And if it's academic press and productive culture or pastoral care for kids, both that you need, we need to track. The assessment system has to track what we value, which means we need to build out assessment systems more thoroughly. And then the other piece I think that spends a lot of, when you get into that standard, spend some time on is the notion of most of the assessment we give kids is is decontextualized. It's not actually connected to what they would do in real life or on the job. So this notion of trying to get curriculum and assessment to mirror what kids actually do is really a critical part, I think, of effective schools for sure, and what principals struggle with to make great schools come to life. Then when we look at culture, and again these things overlap, but just to analyze it, what we see is that this community of care for students was not highlighted in the initial 1996 standards. It was in there, but it was buried, and this is what we've learned from practice and from the research, is that if you cannot put your hand on a child in your school and confirm that that child is known, cared for, respected, valued, has opportunity to participate in the school, has stake ownership in the building, has opportunities to lead, if you can't answer those questions with evidence, you don't really know whether you have pastoral care for kids, community of care for kids or not. There's a lot of weight placed on these in the new standards. We talk about support, we talk about safety, we talk about membership, all the things I mentioned at the start. That's a very important aspect. This, I think, would be, if somebody said, what's really critically new, I would point to this as one of the 3 or 4 things that's just profoundly different from the old standards, and obviously an important one. There's also a standard on professional community for teachers, and that means this is a norm-driven, not an intervention-driven idea. So you can say, well, Murph, we have a PLC. Well, it's not a PLC that we want to see from principals. We want principals to work at the level of ensuring that professional norms are in place in their school. So I would say that's great. You have a PLC. What are the powerful norms that you are developing? And there you would want to see things like teachers have ownership for what happens to children. When the finger of why things didn't work gets pointed, we pointed at ourselves, not at other people. The notion of documenting deep collaborative work among a teaching staff. These are the kind of norms that we talk about when we talk about the standard, and it's the norms that we're going after, not the box you put the norms in. You can put the norms in 5 or 6 or 7 different boxes, and they will work for you. But if you import a box, like a professional learning community, and you think it's going to bring the norms with you, that's probably not going to happen. So the struggle, I think, for school leadership is how to focus this conversation on the norms, not the interventions themselves. Third piece of community culture, what we use the language synonymously, is communities of engagement for families. This has actually been fairly interesting to study, especially in high schools. As a profession, we've been in sort of reaching out a little bit. We've done a lot of PR for families and community. We've done a lot less actually trying to figure out how you create partnerships between public schools and parents in the kind of depth that we need to do. So we give some pretty good ideas there, some big ideas, I think, that, again, would anchor the work of secondary school leaders a lot. So that's there. And then the last one is, again, this is one that was underemphasized in the past. I think is very important. There's a strong sense that, for lots of reasons, not to blame us, but we need to do something about it, and that is there are lots of children who are at risk in schools, which is no surprise to anybody on the phone, and there are lots of reasons that occurs. A lot of those are explained by communities and families and government policy around things. But the bottom line is, that's not. We can't sort of allow that to happen given what's going on. So this notion of an equitable and just and fair culture and climate for kids that's culturally congruent with their own lives and their own families and their own styles is really critical. And it just as an example, we looked at the work on high schools were doing. I go back when I was administrator. It's never even crossed our mind. But the notions of the attention that principals provide and the meaning of that provision of attention around issues of sexual identity, sexual expression, and sexual orientation is light years from where it has been. It's not where it needs to be, but when it happens because principals are on point for creating culturally appropriate and just communities where children are taken care of and respected and known, and not marginalized and not defined in terms of absence or subtraction. So that's real exciting. We think that's a really important piece of the school effectiveness storyline. It's a critical piece of the school effective leader storyline. So we've made it very, very explicit in the standards. So you see 7 standards up here. I'll introduce the last 4. First, or the 8th, if you will, is this notion of vision. And we're not talking about saints and martyrs here. We're talking about leaders who are very profoundly direct about what they want their school to be and what they want the people and their colleagues in the school to move towards and what they want their communities to move towards in big norms and big values and big ideas. I'm not talking here about a vision of moving from the 25th percentile to the 52nd percentile. That's an objective, that's a goal, it's certainly important, but it's hardly a vision for a school about how to improve. So we look at that literature and you interview really effective principals and superintendents, you see this powerful discussion around key values and key norms that are essential to how they got to be really good organizations. The flip side of that, if we had to put 2 together, we put these 2 together, is this ability to really have this evidence-based, ongoing examination of how you're doing, and then working back out to make improvements. So, for example, let's just say, go back to the pastoral care one, and we're working on that, and we're continuous mood. So we find out that we do an exercise, which we did yesterday at Learning Forward, and we find out that 18% in the kids are not in the school are not really known, which is not an unusual number, by the way. When you cut through it and you don't let people get off by saying, yes, we care about kids, but you actually ask. And then, so the question is, we now know that about 18% of our kids are not well known by people at school. That is, no particular adult feels that they know that student well. Where students don't feel that adults know them well, then the continuous improvement is you target those 18 kids, or 18%, just like you would target special ed kids or English language learners or any other group, and you put into place a series of strategies. So at X period of time, when you go back and ask, that number drops to 5% or 2%, right? It's that kind of continuous improvement that we're talking about, and we're talking about it both across the academic side and the cultural side. You can't academically press kids placed at disadvantage into being great students. That's just not going to happen. So the notion of this continuous monitoring and improvement around culture is a central part of our storyline. Productive management. Management is the central dimension of what we do as school leaders. I think that's pretty obvious. The question I think that we tried to get at here is not only to acknowledge and honor that management issue, but it's also to try to connect management to what we call the educational function of the school. So you can process a budget with your eye on finance, or you can process your budget with an eye on finance and an eye on finding resources for at-risk kids. You can set up a busing system in a school to move kids around, and you can do that very appropriately with a function on management of transportation, or you can do it with that as well as an educational function. One of the people I talked to last week on this, part of the busing system was having adults ride on the bus with children on a rotating basis, and some of those were teachers, some of those were parents, some of those were community leaders, but the busing system was not only about moving kids, but it was creating a sense of care for kids, and also having these adults talk to kids about the academics. And according to this principle, it was a really profound movement of how kids felt about it and how teachers felt about it. So the point here is principals make 1,200 decisions a day. And a lot of those are managing and operating the system. But when you do those, if you can also have an eyeball on the educational aspects that are possible, you can get more out of it. And then the last, the ethical leadership one is the fourth one. So that's number 11. So you can see right now we have all 11 standards up there. The ethical leadership one is pretty clear, and that is principals make ethical decisions all the time. And to pretend that these are all data-driven decision-makings, and if we have the data, we're going to make the right decision, is really dishonest to a certain extent. And it's important, it's essential, but it's not the totality. And principals make all sorts of ethical decisions all the time. And what the standards argue for is we should acknowledge and be clear about that. We should know what we're thinking about when we do that. We should have principals who are advocates for the children in schools, not just educators and not just politicians and not just managers, but strong advocates for kids as well. So that's really the picture of the standards. Again, the main thing here I would say, they all grow out of these two profound, critical, essential, defining dimensions of great schooling: academic press, productive culture, and then what we've done is we've defined that in terms of 11 standards now, and then under those standards, which I won't bore you with, there's somewhere between 5 and 7 or so defining norms that talk about each of those. So that is the official story of the new ISLLC Standards 2015, which again are at the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Policy Board for approval right now. And I think that is all I have to say until later.
Thank you, Joe. We don't seem to have any questions, so at this time I'd like to say thank you, Dr. Murphy, for taking the time and your willingness to share your experience and expertise with the ISLLC standards over the past 20 years.
Thank you.
And if you'd like more information about the ISLLC standards, you can contact NASSP, and we'll make sure that you get the resources you need.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Joe.
Bye-bye.
As I said earlier in the broadcast, we would provide you with information about how you can access some of the Wallace products. NASSP is proud to serve as a dissemination partner with the Wallace Foundation, which works to improve learning and enrichment for disadvantaged children. The Foundation projects test innovative ideas for solving important social problems, conducts research to find out what works and what doesn't, and then communicates the results to help others. You may take advantage of this research by connecting with Wallace to access these publications and other work relevant to school leadership at www.wallacefoundation.org/knowledge-center/school leadership. In July 2015, NASSP and Discovery Education will offer the second annual Great Leaders Summit for a very limited audience. It will be held at Discovery World Headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. Stay tuned for more information about how you can participate in the 2015 Great Leaders Summit. We'd also like to invite you to participate with us at Ignite 15 in San Diego, February 19 through 21. You can learn about the conference and register on the address shown on the slide, www.nasspconference.org. Thank you today for joining us in this webinar, and thanks again to Dr. Murphy. We hope to see all of you in San Diego. And that concludes our webinar for today.